Hi, kiddos. In today's lecture, we are going to be tackling nutrient cycles. So why are nutrient cycles so incredibly important? It has to do with the way we build our bodies. So let's think about it. We're trying to build a house, and you've got plenty of bricks, you have plenty of mortar, but you run out of nails. You can't build the house even though you have plenty of bricks and mortar. You need the nails to build the frame, etc. So it's kind of the same thing with your bodies. Like, if you have plenty of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, you're good to go there, but you're missing another key component to build one of your biological molecules, it's just not going to be built. And so you'll notice that these are elements, these are abiotic components that are then integrated into living bodies and living systems. And so what we're going to be talking about in this lecture are the nutrient cycles and those abiotic and biotic interactions and how we cycle matter on our planet. Check out my face covering up the macromolecules. All right, so we've got macromolecules here. This is a carbohydrate. Remember, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Biochemistry back again. Right? And then we got the lipids, which are long strands of just carbon and hydrogen with a little bit of oxygen here and there, right? And then we've got an amino acid. We have our amine group, right? And then we have our carboxylic acid group. And then we have our R group, which actually determines which amino acid it is. I want you to notice now we've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So those are key players in these two molecules. But now we're adding some nitrogen in. And then we've got our last big macromolecule. And that was nucleic acids, right? So we've got nucleic acids right here, and the nucleic acids have nitrogen in it, right? So we have our 5-carbon sugar, our nitrogen base, but we also have this phosphate group. So right now we're looking at carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Okay, so limiting nutrients. Limiting nutrients are if an organism does not have enough of all of the tools it needs to make its macromolecules. So let's say you've got plenty of carbon, plenty of hydrogen, plenty of oxygen, but you're missing some nitrogen. You're not going to be able to make proteins, nor will you be able to make nucleic acids. In fact, in ecosystems, especially aquatic ecosystems, nitrogen and phosphorus are typically limiting factors. And this is good in some ways because different plants and different animals have special ways of getting these nutrients, and they pull it into the system. So if you looked at an aquatic ecosystem, right, is going to have limited nitrogen and phosphorus, right? And then all of a sudden, we've got a farmer. And the farmer also has limited nitrogen and phosphorus, but he wants his plants to grow up big and strong. So what is he going to do? He's going to add nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil. That's what fertilizer is. So he adds some nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil, and his plants start growing and accumulating more and more biomass, building up nice and strong, right? But also, he's going to water his plants, and rain's going to come down. And rain is going to absorb some of that phosphorus and nitrogen, and it's going to wash into the local waterway. Well, the plants in the local waterway are going to do really well too. But not just the nice plants on the bottom. There's also going to be floating plants and phytoplankton. Remember, phytoplankton is plant plankton. So what's going to happen? They're going to grow really fast. We know that plankton can grow faster than regular plants, right? They can double every few hours. And so suddenly we've got an algal bloom. When we have high nutrient conditions, we call that eutrophic conditions. And when we have low nutrient conditions in an aquatic ecosystem, we call it oligotrophic conditions. Now, eutrophic, because it has high nutrients, doesn't necessarily mean good and healthy conditions. Think algae bloom. Right? So I just want you to be aware that limiting nutrients, if supplied, can cause changes to the ecosystem which are very negative. Remember my saying where energy flows and matter cycles? What you're looking at here is scientists trying to figure out how much carbon is cycling in this nutrient cycle. So remember, the Earth is a closed system. The matter that was on our planet when it blew up and recoalesced 4.6 billion years ago is the same amount of matter that we have today. So in order for living things to incorporate it into their bodies, they have to get it from the abiotic matter that's available on our planet. And so these nutrient cycles are how we transition between that abiotic to the biotic and back to the abiotic. And so that's the cycle that we're looking at here. And you can see that the amount of available, in this case carbon, can be calculated in a lot of different ways. You can look at, for instance, if I was trying to calculate the amount of carbon available in plant biomass, I could take down a whole bunch of plants. I could burn them and assess it that way. I could dry them and determine the mass of the plant biomass, and then based on that get like an average molecular weight of carbon that would be part of that biomass and calculate the amount of carbon there. There's lots of ways I can assess that. You can get dissolved carbon meters, and you can calculate dissolved carbon in the ocean and the surface waters and at various depths as well. But what I want to talk to you about is I want to start introducing these cycles, and we're going to start with, surprise, the carbon cycle. All right, so first of all, as we're talking about nutrient cycles, I need you to be aware of some key vocabulary. First of all, when I'm talking about a source, I'm talking about where I'm going to get the element from. And oftentimes in a general term, and I would say, where's the big source of carbon dioxide? You would say, the atmosphere, right? Because that's where I'm going to find most of it. So we talk about that as a source. Sometimes we can kind of sequester or put away an element for a really long time, and we call that a sink. So there's a source and there's a sink, right? And then there's also going to be different geological timescales to some different cycles. So for instance, a plant, like let's say I've got some great herbs growing at home right now, right? So I take my basil, I nosh on it, I break down the sugars, I use those calories within hours, I breathe them out, and I return CO2 into the atmosphere. So the plant took CO2 out of the atmosphere, used it to grow some leaves. That took a few weeks. I ate the plant. In a few hours, I breathed it back out. And so that was a very quick cycle. Some cycles take 300 million years or even longer to complete. So for instance, in the carbon cycle, once again, you could have like this exchange where you fix carbon. By the way, the word fix means to take from an unusable form to a usable form. So plants fix carbon from the atmosphere and turn it into organic sugar, right? So that's where that term could fit in there. Now remember, phytoplankton or plant plankton is going to also do photosynthesis. So phytoplankton will also fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into organic molecules like sugars, and then zooplankton eat the plant plankton or the phytoplankton, and then larger fish eat that, okay? What ends up happening is that those phytoplankton and zooplankton and larger organisms eventually will probably die, especially if they fall out of the photic zone, which is right here where the sun can penetrate. And they fall down as sediment in the ocean, and they lay down on the ocean floor, okay? We call that flocculation. It's not a cool word. So it lays down on the ocean floor, and eventually it'll get covered up with layers and layers and layers and layers, and that can eventually become fossil fuels, or it can just stay sequestered in those sediments. So because it's saying sequestered in the sediments, we could call that a carbon sink. So in the deep ocean, there's a large amount of dissolved dissolved carbon and carbon-containing sediment, and we call that a carbon sink. If it turns into fossil fuels, which can happen on land as well as in the water, if it turns into fossil fuels, we also call that a carbon sink, because it'll stay as fossil fuels deep within the earth for a very, very long time, or until people pump it out and burn it and release it back into the atmosphere. Now, one of the reasons why we're so concerned about carbon is not that just that it is a necessary component for building macromolecules, but also because it's a greenhouse gas. And what that means is it's a clear gas that allows light to come into our planet, but because it's a little bit thicker, bigger molecule than, say, oxygen is, when we burn oxygen and turn it into carbon dioxide, we make the atmosphere a little bit thicker, and just like putting on a thicker blanket, it traps a little bit more heat. Now, a little bit of a difference isn't a big deal, but if you stay there for a really long time, and you still have that same amount of sunlight going on, and you keep thickening and thickening up the blanket, you're going to actually end up trapping enough heat where it's going to change things like oceanic temperature, and it's going to start altering currents, weather patterns, all sorts of stuff. I know that you know this cycle. It is the H2O cycle, right? It's the water cycle. And so how does the water cycle work? Well, you know most of this. You could probably say it with me. Evaporation, condensation, transpiration, precipitation, right? So let's think about a few words that are on this little chart that you may not know about. So there's evaporation from surface waters, and there's also transpiration. We've discovered relatively recently that a huge amount of the water in the atmosphere is transpired from plant leaves. And so transpiration is like tree sweat. You can think of like perspiration, but it's for trees, so transpiration. And then you've got condensation, where the water molecules start to condense closer together, where they start forming clouds, and eventually, if they accumulate enough water, then that water is going to become heavy enough where it's going to want to fall out of the sky. And that is when you have precipitation. So you can also, however, have sublimation, which is when you go straight from a solid to a gas, and that would happen like top of mountain peaks. But when there is precipitation, you're going to have runoff, or you're going to have infiltration. And infiltration is into the soil, whereas percolation, you may not be able to see, the slide. There we go. You may not be able to see it, but there's also percolation. In percolation, it works down the layers of rock, and the water goes in to replenish the aquifers. There's another key word that you can't see right here, and that's assimilation. Assimilation is when a molecule or an element is taken up by a plant. Okay, so we call that assimilating. Okay, kiddos. So now we're into the N from chomp, okay? And this looks so scary, but it really isn't. So just stick with me for a second and you're going to totally rock this. Now, first of all, the big source for nitrogen is going to be in the atmosphere. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. The thing is I can't nosh on nitrogen and build myself some proteins, right? Because that nitrogen isn't what we say available for uptake, right? So it's not easily assimilated into my body in that format. So first of all, we have to take the nitrogen in its unusable form. We have to transition it into a usable form. We can't do that. There are two major ways that this could happen. The first is lightning can chemically alter the atmospheric nitrogen and if it gets carried down with precipitation, it can get integrated into the soil and then get uptaken by plants. The second way, which is much more common, are our friends the microbes in the soil can actually take nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, and turn it into usable nitrogen in the soil. Now, remember, if you take an element that's unusable and you turn it into a usable form, we call that fixing. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into a usable nitrogen form. This usable nitrogen form could be ammonia or nitrite. So those are okay as far as being nitrogen sources in the soil. However, they cannot be assimilated yet by plants. So ammonia is like what we pee out as well. And in fact, it can actually be toxic to plants if it accumulates too much. Like if you pee in the same spot in your yard every day, not saying that you would pee in your yard, but if you peed in the same spot every day, it's going to turn yellow and all the plants are going to die, right? And so what happens then? Well, there's a second set of microbes, and like nitrifying microbes will go take the nitrite and they'll turn it into nitrate. That's what the plants ate. So nitrite, turn it into nitrate that the plants ate, right? Okay, so we're going to remember ate. That's what the plants ate, or the plants can't assimilate the nitrate, right? So let's remember that ate is a really, really good thing for them. In fact, that's the most easily assimilated form of nitrogen. Ammonia can also go through ammonification, and it gets turned from ammonia into ammonium. Yummy, right? Ammonium. Okay, so ammonium can also be assimilated by some plants and some other animals, but in general, nitrate is where it's at. Okay, so story so far. Nitrogen mostly in the atmosphere, hard to get to it. Special microbes are able to fix the nitrogen, so we call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. Then that bacteria turns it into either ammonia or nitrite. Nitrifying bacteria turn nitrite into nitrate. And the process of ammonification, which is several steps you don't need to know, turns ammonia into ammonium. Okay? So, one other thing that you need to know is the nitrogen-fixing bacteria can be free in the soil, but most often they're associated with a symbiotic plant, like beans, like soybeans, green beans, fava beans, right? Lima beans. I feel like I could come up with all sorts of great beans. But as a class, they're called legumes. And so legumes have this great symbiotic relationship with this nitrogen-fixing bacteria because the legumes want nitrogen. They create tissues heavy in protein, right? And so they want nitrogen, and so they create these little nodules in their roots where they like leak out yummy like syrups for the microbes. And so the microbes move into these little nodules and they fix nitrogen for the plant, and the plant feeds the nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is a really, really great relationship. We would call that mutualism, I think. Yeah. Okay. So back to the story so far. There we go. Nitrogen is in the atmosphere, and it can be fixed by lightning, but mostly by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which then turn it into nitrite or ammonia, and through nitrification, it can be turned into nitrate, which the plants assimilate, or it can go through ammonification and be turned into ammonium, which can also be turned into nitrite and nitrate eventually. So there's that. So then the plants assimilate it, the animals eat the plants, right? And then the plants and the animals die, and they can be decomposed, and denitrifying bacteria can break down these nitrogen molecules and turn them back into N2. So now we finally completed the cycle. I know there's a lot of little steps in here, but you break down, decompose the living matter, and it turns back into atmospheric nitrogen. Something else that you should know is that there are some nitrogen in gasoline and other fossil fuel sources, and sometimes those can also be put into the atmosphere. And they can be released as N2 or nitrous oxides, and nitrous oxides are also a greenhouse gas. So we're finally to the P in chomp, right? And that is for the phosphorus cycle. Remember, the phosphorus cycle is the phosphorus group is in nucleic acids. And phosphorus is different from the other cycles in that it is a very long geological cycle. This isn't like, oh, I'm going to fix some nitrogen. I'm going to eat the plant. I'm going to die. I'm going to decompose back to the atmosphere. It's not like that. It's not a quick cycle. I mean, if you're thinking about like a lifetime, 10 decades, when you're looking at geologic time, is nothing. It's not even a breath of air. Okay? So phosphorus, however, phosphorus is its big sink and its big store, its source is rock, right? So think about that. How do you pull minerals from rock? Well, you pull minerals from rock through weathering, erosion, and eventually leaching of the nutrients from the mineral source into the water, which then hopefully gets to some plants, which suck it up, and then some animals are able to eat it. And then eventually that phosphorus has to be turned back into rock. So how does that happen? Well, animals die, we decompose, we turn into mineral matter. The mineral matter lays on top of each other. Eventually it sinks lower and lower. There's more pressure. It turns slowly into rock. If it goes for long enough, it gets pulled into the magma, can explode out of a volcano, or it can, through geological upheaval, turn back into a mountain, which then slowly gets eroded away, right? So we're talking, it takes a long time to erode a mountain. So this is a very long cycle. Here in Florida, we have phosphorus mining pits because our bedrock is heavy in phosphorus. So let's think about the state of Florida. Okay, we used to be underwater. We were a pretty shallow area underwater. In fact, we used to be one ginormous, massive reef, right? And so that ginormous, massive reef had shells and oysters and all sorts of great stuff, right? And so then it got exposed, right? And so now our land is actually old reef. So if you dig into that, those organic molecules are, the organic molecules have been turned into mineral molecules, right? They've been turned into limestone. And that limestone is heavy in phosphorus. And so in some areas of our state, in fact, we have a pit mine in Alva. You can see phosphorus pit mining here in Florida. Why do we need phosphorus? Remember, phosphorus and nitrogen are what we use to make fertilizer. So, the moral of the story, phosphorus, right? It gets eroded, it gets into the streams, it gets uptaken by living organisms, either here or in the ocean. Eventually, those organisms die and turn into rock, and then the rock can be re-exposed to erosive forces. I know it was a long one. Thank you for your time, energy, and effort. I hope that that helped to clarify what the sources for the major mineral elements were, how they were fixed into biological systems, how whether or not they have sinks and what those sinks are, how we pull them out of the system and why that might be important, and also how the biotic components get returned into abiotic mineral components. So if you know all of that, then you've got this nailed, and I hope that I made it clear for you. You have an awesome day.